This talk is part of our Hindi-Urdu Flagship program. Um, I'm very happy Professor Asani is with us today on such a beautiful day. Introducing him is very difficult for me because he's my teacher and I have known him for 18 years. And the only person in the room I have known for a longer time is Professor Minot, who's sitting back there. So, I'm humbled in the presence of my teachers. And Dav Dehlavi, one of the great poets from Delhi who migrated to Hyderabad, has a lovely couplet in which he says, "Ishq ke aate hi muh par mere phuli hai basant, ho gaya zard ye shagird jo ustad aaya," which can be translated very poorly as soon as love arrived, spring bloomed on my face, this student turned pale upon the arrival of the teacher. So my introduction is going to be pale in comparison to what he really is, who he really is. So as I said, I have known him for many, many years. He has been teaching at Harvard since the early 80s, and before that he was a student there since the early 70s. So he has been there for almost 40 years. He studied under the great scholar of Islam, Anna Marie Schimmel, whose work has inspired so many of us who changed the field of Islamic studies. And one of the things that drew me to Professor Asani was that even before new literary criticism, new literary theories became fashionable, Professor Asani used these theories, this criticism in his work in the late 70s and early 80s. So his first book, which is a very close reading of Ismaili literature of medieval India, is also a great example of how intertextual studies should be done, because he looks at the relationship between Sufi discourses and Shia discourses of the South Asian subcontinent, and it's a model work of close reading. And he's also a very versatile scholar from medieval times. He has moved into the modern ones, and he has been working a lot on representation of Muslims. He has become a public intellectual in the last 10 years, especially after 9/11. His book, Infidel of Love, is going to come out from Harvard University Press very soon. He's also a master teacher. Those people who have studied with him, it's very difficult to find a better teacher, a better language teacher, a better religious studies teacher than this one. And again, in the South Asian culture, to praise somebody on their face is considered sort of weird and cheesy. So I should, refrain from that. I think the couplet should have probably done the magic. So without more delay, again, I want to welcome Professor Asani, and I'm sure you'll get a lot of pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, very kind and generous introduction. I'm particularly happy to be back here at UT Austin because it also brings back memories of another connection I had with UT Austin, aside from the Akbar connection, and that is I was involved for many years with the Islamic Cultural Studies initiative here, where we were working with the UTeach program to reach out to high school teachers in the Texas area to create better literacy about Islam and Muslim cultures and societies. And that particular project was trying to promote the viewpoint that the study of a religion and a religious tradition has to take into account that religion and religious expressions are essentially cultural phenomena that are embedded in and intricately interwoven with political, social, and economic context. And therefore, the study of religious traditions, devotional literatures, have to be, by definition, interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. And also recognizing that religious traditions, devotional traditions are never static, they're dynamic as the context in which they're in, the political, economic, and social context. The traditions themselves change and are informed by larger, I would say, cultural changes. And this is, of course, very apparent when one looks at the emergence of what I would say Muslim devotional literatures in South Asia through the centuries. So we know, for instance, that South Asia's diverse literary traditions, whether they're in the northern areas or the southern areas, or whether they're in Punjab or in Bengal, wherever they are, South Asia's literary traditions have provided both the structure and the idiom for Muslims belonging to a variety of different religious persuasions to express and transmit their ideas. So we find, we find that very early on in different regions of South Asia, we have Muslims picking up different literary traditions to express ideas, and in this context, we have to highlight the use of vernacular forms of literature, folk poetry, women's poetry, as being quite instrumental, as Richard Eaton has shown, for example, in the region of Bijapur, that's here, in this region here, really from the 16th, 17th century onwards, we have this whole genre of Muslim devotional literature that uses women's work songs, for example, you know, the Chakhinama, as they are grinding grain, or as they're weaving cotton and so on, that they're using these, the structures of these songs to actually impart basic religious precepts. Similarly, we know that in other regions, for instance, in the Punjab area and in Sindh, people have used spinning songs in the same way to impart religious knowledge. But it's not only just the folk song tradition that has been used, the vernacular tradition that has been used, but we also know that South Asia's different musical traditions have also been employed. And these musical traditions have not only, I think, influenced expression of religious ideas, but I think have also impacted ritual, Muslim ritual practice, how the faith itself is practiced and understood. So, for example, I think a prime example of this is the Qawwali, which is deeply, in one sense, deeply embedded in the musical traditions of North India, and you find poets singing verses in Hindi and Urdu and Persian and Arabic and so on, in this ritual of summa, with the intention of making listeners forget their material existence and experience spiritual ecstasy by finding God. And from this tradition, of course, has evolved the tradition of the Qawwali. And as a devotional genre, the Qawwali highlights singing as an integral act of worship, that the singing itself is worship. A characteristic that is a central characteristic, I think, to the ethos of religious practice all over the subcontinent, regardless of transcending religious traditions. So we find the Qawwali itself, as it emerged as a form of singing and prayer through singing, shares a strong South Asian element to it. Now, in the last century or so, thanks to a variety of interrelated factors, such as the revolution in media technology, globalization, the spread of popular Western culture, and also, I would say, the rise of religiously based nationalisms, the form, content, and context of South Asian Muslim devotional expressions have been radically transformed. Even a cursory reflection on the subject reveals significant changes taking place on several different fronts. Prominent artists of Muslim devotional music, most notably the late Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, the 20th century's finest exponents of Qawwali music, and Abida Parveen, the eminent singer of Punjabi and Sindhi Sufi poetry, have transformed the scope of the traditional Qawwali and the Sufiana Kalam, so that they are no longer of limited regional or local significance, but have become prominent genres of world music. On the other hand, as is evident from the numerous cassettes and CDs and DVDs of Muslim devotional music available at many Sufi dargahs, shrines in India, melodies from Bollywood, India's mega film industry, have profoundly influenced Sufi song traditions. In a recent study, Peter Manuel has shown that, in fact, the traditional Sufi Qawwali has been dramatically transformed by all these factors, and particularly, I would say, the Bollywood influence, so that several subgenres have emerged, such as the filmy Qawwali, which has often come to be symbolic of Muslim-Hindu composite culture in films, the secular stage Qawwali, with its tantalizing duets between male and female groups of singers, the entertainment Qawwali, performed at elite weddings and parties, and more recently, the disco Qawwali. In Pakistan, interestingly, at certain periods in Pakistan's history, depending on the ruling ideology, the ideology of the ruling regime, Qawwali has acquired a new religio-political significance since it has been promoted as the official devotional music of the Muslim and/or Islamic State, sometimes receiving special treatment on radio and television as a way of propagating quote-unquote Islamic values. So this is by way of background. So my topic for today is the emergence of Sufi Rock, which is a new genre of Muslim devotional expression that seems to have originated first in Pakistan. And it is a genre which fuses Western rock music with traditional Sufi poetry and imagery, and it is commonly associated with its earliest exponents, associated especially I think in the South Asian diaspora particularly, with Salman Ahmad, a guitarist and vocalist in South Asia's biggest rock band, Junoon. With over 25 million albums sold, Junoon won several awards and distinctions, including UNESCO's Award for Outstanding Achievement in Music and Peace in 1999. And Salman himself has earned an international reputation as an artist activist, using music and lyrics frequently inspired by the Sufi tradition, and he draws mostly, as you'll see, from the Punjabi Sufi tradition, but also on the works of Iqbal and so on, to promote peace and tolerance. On account of his activism, he has been called the Bono of the Muslim world, all right, the Bono of the Muslim world. Of course, a reference to the iconic Bono, renowned for internationally for his activism against poverty and other social causes. Salman has also been designated as UN Goodwill Ambassador in the HIV/AIDS campaign in South Asia. Now, although Junoon has been temporarily disbanded, this is the term that Salman uses, in 2002, Salman has continued performing on his own, recently producing a solo album, Infinity, containing several popular compositions. Now, the kind of Sufi rock that has emerged, that Salman was influential in formulating. Salman, and I would also say that, you know, this is a whole band of his, really draws on three different sources. It draws on first John Lennon of the Beatles, the artist activist who employed rock music to promote peace. Right, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, the famous exponent of Qawwali, who infused music drawn from a variety of cultures, variety of sources, with spirituality in an attempt to make it a bridge between different cultures. And what I would say the traditional South Asian Sufi tradition, the vernacular tradition, most notably that of Bulleh Shah, the 17th century Sufi poet, who, imbibed with the love of God and humanity, challenged narrow and intolerant interpretations of religion. Now, Salman's contribution to the emergence of Sufi rock can best be appreciated within the framework of his personal and spiritual development as a rock musician, who is deeply engaged with and committed to Islam, particularly its Sufi interpretation. So a little bit of his background, because I think people's own contexts are influential in shaping their worldviews. So Salman was born in 1963 in Lahore, Pakistan, where as a young boy he attended Meyerson College. And the faculty of, let me see if I have that picture here. Oops, sorry, no, I don't, okay. And the faculty of that elite educational institution, I'm sure those of people who are from Pakistan know about Meyerson College, a college that has roots going back to the British colonial times. So the faculty of this elite educational institution, in Salman's words, quote, existed in a mental time warp, making every effort to turn out Pakistani boys who were virtually British in thought, opinion, morals, and intellect, unquote. A free spirit, Salman escaped this constricting environment when his family moved to Rockland, New York, and here at the age of 11, he attended a co-ed school, developing a passion for rock music after he attended a Led Zeppelin concert, okay, in Madison Square Garden, being particularly infatuated with Led Zeppelin's guitarist, Jimmy Page. He formed a garage band and spent hours, as he says, jamming to Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and Santana. Understandably, his passion for this kind of rock music aroused his his mother's fear of her son losing his culture and identity as a Pakistani Muslim to Western hedonism. Consequently, after high school, Salman was forced to move back to Pakistan with his family, and his parents persuaded him to give up his dreams of being a rock star and pursue instead a medical career so that he could eventually marry a nice Muslim girl. However, the Pakistan to which Salman and his family returned to after many years was not the one that they had left behind several years ago. It was under the grip of a military ruler, General Zia-ul-Haq, and the country was reeling from a strong current of radicalism. Some of it, I think, was a direct consequence of the Soviet-Afghan War. General Zia had imposed an interpretation of Islamic law that was trying to wipe out the pluralistic, tolerant Pakistani culture that Salman had known as a child. The mullahs had declared music, Salman's passion, to be un-Islamic. Musicians were banished from state-controlled television and radio. Only religious songs without musical instrumentation were tolerated on the airwaves. Clubs were closed. Music went underground and could not be played at any official functions. The situation on campus of King Edward Medical College, where Salman was studying medicine, mirrored that of the larger society and the country as a whole. The campus was overrun by weapons, drugs, and student militias who were more interested in fighting battles for their right-wing religious sponsors and patrons than healing patients. So during an unofficial talent show on campus, while Salman was playing on the guitar, a group of student militia belonging to the Jamaat-e-Islami, a party allied with Zia's military regime, stormed into the hall screaming in Urdu, "Ye fahashi band karo, stop this vulgarity." The group ordered all the girls to cover themselves with their dupattas, their headscarves, and to immediately vacate this place of sin. Some members of the militia rushed angrily onto the stage, snatched Salman's guitar, and smashed it to the floor along with the drum set. For Salman, this incident represented a wake-up call, forcing him to think deeply about the forces dividing his country. Salman responded to this act of intimidation with characteristic vehemence by participating in as many as 7 underground bands, playing as a lead guitarist in secret concerts organized for youth groups. Eventually, he joined a band, Vital Signs, which rocketed to national fame when it managed to sneak past the attention of the censors and performed a patriotic song, Dil Dil Pakistan, on Pakistan national TV. The national broadcast of this song captured the imagination of Pakistani youth, who regarded this as a liberating breath of fresh air in an otherwise repressive atmosphere of religious fascism. Overnight, Salman and his fellow band members became national pop stars. The religious right was understandably disturbed, but as Salman puts it, the genie was out of the bottle. And this, in a way, it reminds me a lot about what's been going on in Egypt. You just need a couple of people to mobilize things. In any case, Salman realized that music could be used as a counterforce to religious extremism. He put down the stethoscope and picked up the guitar as a full-time professional musician. Music, he decided, could heal the country. Following Zia-ul-Haq's death in an air crash in 1988, and the collapse with him of the regime that was associated at the time, Pakistan experienced a period of relaxation. It may have been political chaos, but It was a period of relaxation in cultural expression, making life easier for musicians. Now, Salman's talents as a guitarist brought him to the attention of the renowned Qawwal, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, who at the time was experimenting with incorporating Western instrumentation, Western instruments and fusion music into the Qawwali. He had, for example, collaborated with Peter Gabriel on the soundtrack of The Last Temptation of Christ. Although some purists regarded Nusrat's experiments to be a betrayal of the Qawwali tradition and even blasphemous, Nusrat himself favored this fusion of musical traditions because he believed that it was a powerful way to celebrate and express human diversity to music, an impulse he believed was in accordance with the Quranic precept that God loves diversity. The 2 years that Salman spent under Nusrat's tutelage sparked an interest in learning more about the Sufi interpretations of Islam and Sufi poetry, particularly that of Bulleh Shah, he picked up this love of Bulleh Shah from Nusrat. He also began to appreciate the mystically tinged poetry of Allama Muhammad Iqbal, the iconic poet-philosopher who is commonly regarded as the spiritual founder of Pakistan. He found Nusrat's voice and songs to be addictive and contagious. Elaborating on Nusrat's influence on him, he says, "The poetry and the melodies opened doors inside my head which allowed Rumi, Bulleh Shah, and Iqbal to enter and coexist with John Lennon, Jimmy Page, and John Lee Hooker." So you have that interesting combination. Salman's appreciation of Punjabi Sufi poetry led him to contemplate the possibility of combining Sufi lyrics into rock music. When he eventually founded a band, Junoon, he insisted that the music they played should have a purpose, a goal. As Salman puts it, "I hadn't quit medicine just to be a pin-up boy. I wanted to use music as a vehicle for social change." In collaboration with Sabir Zafar, he wrote the lyrics of his first Sufi rock composition, Sain. Musically, the piece opens with the notes of the Adhan, the Muslim call to prayer, followed by lyrics representing the pleas of a yearning lover. So let me just, for those of you who haven't, here's Salman, and he's exploring the different elements of Sufism. So let me play you just a section. So you get a sense of this. So some segments of Pakistani society reacted negatively to this composition. Why are you using the word of God in a westernized way? You're not showing respect, were some of the criticisms leveled against this song. The piece was banned from Pakistan TV for blasphemous use of God's name. But the youth, especially the burgher class, who were educated in English medium schools, loved it for it expressed well their composite identities, cosmopolitan yet embedded in a culture with distinctively Pakistani roots. Junoon's next album, Azadi, dedicated to Nusrat, combined Western acoustic instruments with traditional dholaks and tablas. The lyrics not only refer to traditional Punjabi Sufi mystical themes, such as the famous Soni Mahiwal folk romance, but also contained excerpts from Allama Iqbal's famous poem on Khudi, the self, which focuses on developing the full potential of the human as God's vicegerent and master of destiny. Yet, so let me play you this piece from Azadi.
And Azadi means freedom, and that whole album really had that thread running through the different songs in various ways for the soul seeking freedom. And that album was released in India, and it sort of loosely translates into there's no peace and there's no way out. Sayoni, Sayoni, Sayoni. Sayoni means soulmate.
So there are two things interesting about this particular album. As you can see, of course, he's interpreting this Azadi in a spiritual sense, the freedom of the soul. But of course, it has political undertones, given the political context. But the other controversial aspect about this particular song was that because it contained one of the poems, the lyrics of the icon of Pakistani nationalism, Sir Muhammad Iqbal, people thought that this was belittling Iqbal. But this time, interestingly, Javed Iqbal, the son of Muhammad Iqbal, remarked to Salman that his father would have heartily approved of this composition. So Azadi achieved the honor of being the highest-selling album in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India in 1998 and 1999. Now, alongside the mystical themes, and you can already, and it's really in the tradition of traditional Sufi poetry that there's always an implied political criticism of the social and political establishment. So, not surprisingly, you find that some of Salman's songs became increasingly critical of political developments in Pakistan and in South Asia generally. Their song Intisab, or Accountability, lambasted corrupt politicians and was therefore promptly banned from official Pakistani airways in 1996. In 1998, when India and Pakistan set off nuclear explosions, Junoon released several songs, including a remake of Sayoni, whose lyrics called for peace between the peoples of Pakistan and India. The lyrics acknowledge the similarities and affinities and cultures and traditions of the two nations, thus presenting an alternative to the discourse of demonization favored by nationalist politicians in both countries. So, although members of Junoon were labeled as traitors by the Nawaz Sharif government, yet they won the title of Best International Group and the equivalent of India's MTV Music Awards. Now, Junoon's and particularly Salman's relationship with the state takes an interesting turn with the emergence of a new regime in Pakistan, that of General Pervez Musharraf, who, especially after 9/11, in this effort to combat terror and extremism and this jihadi culture, began promoting Sufism as an authentic Pakistani form of Islam, as opposed to the foreign imported forms associated with the Taliban. So he starts making speeches, for example, telling people that we've forgotten the teachings of the great personalities of Islam, like Bahauddin Zakaria, Hazrat Ganj Bakhsh, Lal Shabazz. These are all prominent Sufi saints of Pakistan, and their shrines are major sites of pilgrimage. He also founded a council called for the promotion of Sufism, so that the state itself got involved in, for example, restoring many different Sufi shrines and so on. And interestingly, Musharraf was a great fan of Junoon, and he occasionally sponsored their concerts, sometimes appearing briefly on stage with them. For his part, Salman decided to join the fight against fundamentalism in his country and abroad by confronting the mullahs of Pakistan's northwest frontier province, who, in alliance with a coalition of Islamist parties, had forbidden music in the region and sought to extend the ban to the rest of the country. Specifically, Salman challenged their claim that music was forbidden in Islam and questioned their authority as the sole arbitrators and interpreters of what was Islamic. And he produced, in this context, some of you may have seen this documentary, is it The Rock Star and the Mullahs, or The Mullahs and the Rock Star? Quite a sensational piece, but in any case, it tries to capture his confrontation with this. So, now, the emergence of Sufi rock as a genre, all right, has had, I would say, multiple levels of significance. There are many other groups that I can talk about that continue these, the tradition that Junoon and Salman Ahmad started, but we don't have the time to go into them. So it's not that they're not important, but it's just in the interest of time. But this, I wanted to give you a sense of the genesis of the tradition. So it created a positive identity for Pakistani society, a positive identity for Pakistani youth by rejecting the excesses of the Islamization policies instituted under the dictatorship of General Zia. It redefined what it meant to be Pakistani by drawing on a framework that included the national and literary, the national literary and religious icons, such as the Sufi poet Bulle Shah and the philosopher Allama Iqbal, but cast them within a modern cosmopolitan ethos. Second, the Junoon's use of Sufi poetry became, interestingly, and the iconic face and sound of a contemporary and modern Pakistan in India, a representation that resonated with what many Indians themselves who were steeped in traditions of Sufism could identify with. And of course this became an antidote to the nationalist discourse represented by the politicians. So this highlighted the commonalities of culture. It was therefore a face that was different, that's represented by the government and also by conservative mullahs. It also, the significant appeal, I would say, of Sufi rock to South Asian audiences was also enhanced by the fact that it was developed independently of Bollywood, India's mega entertainment industry, which often tends to smother musical traditions in South Asia by co-opting them. Sufi rock also, of course, highlighted the role of the Sufi voice within the Islamic tradition as a counter to the politicized Islam that was promoted by the regime of Zia-ul-Haq, the Taliban, and so on. It resonated in the later period with the Musharraf regime's emphasis on enlightened moderation. Yet, as the Musharraf regime became increasingly dictatorial and autocratic, in 2008, Salman Ahmad distanced himself from it, becoming, in fact, one of the most vocal opponents of Musharraf. Now, Junoon's use of music, of Sufi rock, as a vehicle to express mistrust and mistrust of the hegemony of religious and political authority, its attempt to overturn rigid and exclusively constructed interpretations of religion, and to call for social justice resonates with the roles that Sufis and Sufi poetic traditions have historically played in Muslim societies. In the Western world, Sufi rock represents an expression of Muslim devotional music that challenges the popular stereotypes of Islam and Muslims as being rigid, inflexible, and anti-Western. Salman, Sufi rock's most prominent exponent, has come to be seen in the media and political and cultural circles as a quote-unquote modern Muslim who has successfully combined his triple heritage, Western, Pakistani, and Muslim. And by synthesizing and transnationalizing several local traditions, Sufi rock therefore has come to represent an alternative discourse about religion and culture in Muslim societies, demonstrating that tradition and modernity and Islam and the West can easily coexist, at least musically. Now, I do want to spend just a few minutes, and then we can open up to questions, about a very interesting trend that I also see that's related to this, that's been happening in India. And I want to say a few words on this. And that is the emergence, the explosion of what I would say a self-described Sufi music of India. As discussed in a paper by Peter Manuel, the styles and subgenres of this movement are diverse, encompassing various genres, including re-articulated forms of traditional Qawwali and Punjabi Sufi song, and much less probable idioms such as Sufi classical khayal and tapa, and in the realm of dance, Sufi Kathak and even Bharatnatyam. Similarly, the Vogue has accommodated performers of disparate motivations, backgrounds, and religious orientations. In accordance with its diversity and complexity, the Sufi music movement in India can be seen from a variety of analytical perspectives, including the local efflorescence of a global Sufi music fad, a revival of an Indian tradition of pluralism and tolerance, or a bourgeois appropriation of a subaltern idiom. Peter Manuel has highlighted its relation to two broad developments in modern Indian society, which have intensified in the last decade. First, the exponential growth of the Indian bourgeoisie as precipitated by economic liberalization policies enacted in the early 1980s, and the more general process of globalization. And second, the continuing intensification and entrenchment of the Hindutva socio-political movement, which champions Hindu pride and power primarily by demonizing Indian Muslims. He argues that the resurgence of the Sufi movement in India is a result of liberal elements in the newly flourishing bourgeoisie, cultivating a fresh interest and celebration of the syncretistic and composite aspects of Indian culture and music. They've also promoted a renewed commitment to secularism, which in the Indian context implies tolerance and religious pluralism rather than opposition to religion. Hence, the new Sufi music is explicitly lauded by the elite as an exemplary site of communal harmony and collaboration. So this was, if you will, just a kind of a footnote to what's been happening in India, but that in itself, as I said, is a whole lecture. So I will open up now for questions. Sorry it's taken a little bit longer, but I'd welcome questions, comments. Thanks. Yeah.
I was just, in the last couple of years, Sufi Islam has been sort of elevated, at least in the Pakistani context, by people like William Dalrymple as the right kind of Islam for Pakistan. And I'm just curious, I mean, it seems to me that this conversation about Junoon is really advancing a narrative like that. And I'm curious as to whether that is the most useful way for us to be looking at what's happening in Pakistan right now.
Okay.
I mean, that sounds like a criticism, which it's not, because I really have enjoyed this. I'm just, for myself, trying to think through this equation of the right kind and the wrong kind of Islam. And this narrative about Sufi Islam has become very public in the New York Times and other places where people who are learning about Pakistan are saying, well, there's this right path, and if only everybody, particularly the middle classes, would get on it, then everybody would just be fine. And so I'm just curious about how that narrative is playing out.
Well, I would say, I mean, from a perspective of a, literary historian and scholar, we can't decide what's right and what's wrong. But what I'm interested in talking about the emergence of these genres, that they have become so prominent. All right? And I said Salman is just one example, but there are several other groups. And what is it trying to, what does this phenomena actually tell us?
Well, what I think of is like Mikhail Hassan, who's a Christian, and that she has
That's right.
Shias and Sunnis and Christians playing, and his band playing exactly this kind of Sufi rock.
But there's this sense of people feeling that nationalist discourses, right, in Pakistan, do not engage with pluralism and diversity. So people are looking for other sites to talk about pluralism and diversity, both within Islam and outside of the Islamic context. And it's the musical traditions where that expression is taking place. And they're finding that this discourse, this engaging, because as you know, one of the biggest issues in Pakistan today, the Pakistani state, is that it has failed to engage with diversity. And it's resulted in all kinds of conflicts. And it's also an issue in India too. I wouldn't say India is exempt from this, and it's led, to genocides and so on and so forth. but it is a central issue in South Asia. But what is interesting is that when people find that the discourses of the nation state, the politicians, and so on, are not addressing those concerns, they're turning to these traditions. But from a perspective of somebody who studies the Sufi traditions, it's interesting to see the revival, like people going back to their roots, looking at Bulleh Shah, looking at, even if you take Abida Perveen and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and so on, is that people are saying, well, these discourses about pluralism, about cultural diversity are part of our heritage, right? And we are losing them. And so there's an attempt, how do we save them? How do we retrieve them? But interestingly, in a way that they see as cosmopolitan. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I enjoyed the talk and also the way you kind of historicized Salman, whom I remember from that era of the late 90s and how important he was. And also the disappointment a lot of people felt when he appeared on stage with Musharraf.
Yeah,
or vice
yeah,
versa.
that's right.
Musharraf
Yeah.
probably inserted himself into the...
That's right, yeah.
But, you touched on it really lightly in your talk about how this form of Sufi rock is also, in a way, a re-articulation of Pakistani nationalism.
Sure, sure.
And
Yeah.
I think it relates a bit to Amber's.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think part of what you're pointing to is really complex, to figure out the ways in which a cosmopolitan, aka globalizing form, can be perhaps on the one hand both very intensely nationalist in ways that could be quite disturbing, but transnationalist also in ways that may not also be so liberating.
Yeah, yeah.
In other words, part of what I've been trying to figure out in terms of thinking through the Hindutva movement is how the transnational and nationalist re-articulations of popular forms can go together. So again, to see Clinton next to Salman
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So you have these really interesting combinations and recombinations, which I think we find all over in it. I loved how your talk also pointed to that. But do you see space in your own reading to say, I mean, you ended by saying you can't decide what's good or bad. I agree with that. But is there more room to talk about how certain strains of Pakistani nationalism, transnationalism, may also use this form of music?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And this is, yeah. But I think what really needs, what I think really needs to happen, I mean, this is where, my own sort of research stopped, is looking at what's happened after, look at all these other bands that have come up, and really trying to analyze what these other bands have been doing, right? And how they relate to not only Pakistanis within a Pakistani context, but also in the diaspora. But I would not just say Pakistanis, but South Asians generally in the diaspora. So I know that there's like groups that have been trying to raise funds for flood victims, right? And they're talking about, well, getting some of these major Pakistani bands, like Noori and so on, to come to the United States and have concerts, all right, as fundraisers, all right? And that's, again, you see that they're tapping on that nationalist Pakistani, that we too have a culture to present to the world, and so on. But I would say that this, my own research has sort of, it's as far as I brought it has really come to this point, but it requires a lot more thought and research with looking at what this whole movement of Sufi rock started out, and then looking at some of the later groups, right? Some of the groups that you alluded to, right? So, yeah.
I always think of Sufism as being counter the state, but historically it's not.
Yeah,
I guess
it can.
Again, it's such a temptation for those of us who love the tradition. And want to keep learning about it.
And I think one of the things that one has to keep in mind, that Sufism itself has a very amorphous nature. And people think about it as mysticism and listening to music and so on, but it's also a political ideology, right? And we always have to keep that in mind. It's not just always about spirituality and mysticism and, you know, in its own way. And if you look at the very early, in the very early figures involved in the origin, people like Al-Hallaj, I would say even Rabia Basri and so on, in their own ways, they were what we would call today's political revolutionaries, you know, for their time, right? So I think thinking about Sufism as a political movement alongside everything else that it represents also is important when we think further about what the significance of this is. Yeah?
I echo and enjoyed your lecture, and what you just said to some degree preempts what I wanted to say. Really thank you for the way you started out saying that religion is very much part of culture and changes. And
yeah.
This has certainly demonstrated that one of the important things it's answering is that religion isn't static, that it changes in a really wonderful way. But I'm curious, as a question, what's the effect on other Sufis, other practicing Sufis in South Asia who maybe aren't into Sufi rock?
Yeah.
You know, because I'm assuming that it comes back into its tradition too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that sort of you do see, because I mean you have these festivals like the one in Delhi, you know, this Jahan-e-Khusrawi that promotes traditional Sufi music, but in the Pakistani context we're finding a lot of the traditional performers are are more and more engaged in coming out on, you know, world music gigs, you know, concerts around the world. So you're seeing, and there are particular organizations in Pakistan that have emerged that realize that this is a product, a cultural product and an image that one can project. And so they are recruiting even, you know, the more traditional musicians, right, to participate in some of these concerts. So aside from Abida Parveen and the Sufi Rock sort of people, but they're looking for traditional qawwals and also the, you know, people in the Punjabi tradition. I'm forgetting this name. Yeah, the names sort of escape me, but there are these traditional performers who are also being co-opted now.
As it always has been.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you had a...
Because Junoon's music draws mostly upon Punjabi traditions, I can imagine it probably has little appeal in the Northwest Frontier Province, where militant Islam and Wahhabism is probably strongest, or other marginal areas of Pakistan. So I'm wondering, like, is Sufi rock being further diversified to incorporate other local traditions, other vernaculars? Is there like a...
Well, right now it's very heavily Punjabi dominated, but I would also say that, you know, some of the lyrics, because he does draw on Iqbal, and, you know, some of the popular verses of Iqbal that any Urdu speaker, you know, would know. And so, you know, iconic verses like Khudi and so on. So that you know, the fame of the group itself was quite widespread. And, you know, the spread, I think, of some of these Taliban-like groups, for example, in the Northwest Frontier Province is more, you know, has been more recent. But, you know, so it predates, in fact, the popularity of Junoon. So groups like Salman, when he went to do the shooting of this documentary, The Rock Stars and the Mullah, in Peshawar, he was just mobbed with the crowds. Everybody came, you know, to see him, to get an autograph, because people had heard about him. All right. So.
I may, thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk. And I'm wondering if I misunderstood something. not seeing it in the right context, because it seemed like a couple of times that Salman or Junoon were talked about as having referenced the Islamic value of diversity. So I'm wondering, is Islamic and are Islamic and Sufi being used interchangeably? Because to the degree that Sufism is kind of like puppy, that goes without saying that diversity is incorporated in that, but not in Islam.
Yeah. Well, I think if you know, what is Islam and, you know, what is non-Islamic, you get very different definitions, right? So do you think about some people, you know, their articulations of what is Islam based within a legal framework. Islam is laws and regulations and the Sharia, especially developed, you know, in the context of some of these Islamist movements. But there are people who would say, and there are people who would say Sufism is not Islam, and say it's un-Islamic, and we see this as a theme in some of the reform revival movements, an attack on Sufism and Sufi practice. But there are other people who would claim that in fact that Sufism is in fact the essence of Islam, and that this is the right Islam. So this debate about what is Islam, all right, whose definition of Islam prevails, becomes dominant, has in fact been part of the larger discourse over many, many centuries. So what I think Salman and this whole, I think, Sufi Rock movement, and, you know, given the situation in Pakistan has done, is that it's revived, I would say, a definition of Islam equals Sufism, all right, in a context where, if you look at the history of the subcontinent in the 19th and 20th century, Sufism was marginalized and declared heretic and un-Islamic. And this has actually now said, no, this is Islamic. Right? So it's reversed the trend itself, and saying that diversity and pluralism are Islamic ideals. And they legitimize this, and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan is really, I think, the first to, in a musical way, to express this by saying that, in fact, that the Quran talks about, I think he cites this verse from the Quran, if I remember correctly, that God made, that we have made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. And so he uses this Quranic verse, that diversity is a form of education and it's a sign of divine genius, all right, to legitimize, you know, what he's trying to do in terms of incorporating, fusing different traditions. So I don't know whether this answers your question, but there is this sense amongst his people that diversity itself is an Islamic value, and they're trying to promote it through the music.
But are they doing that by importing Sufism into the heart of Islam?
Well, the thing is that what they're not importing Sufism, they see Sufism as Islam. They would argue, Salman would probably argue that you cannot say Islam and Sufism are two different things. They'll say Islam is Sufism, all right? There are a variety of interpretations, and for them, this is their interpretation of Islam. All right? Yeah.
Don't you think there's people who have been doing that before? I mean, what I was thinking of was, how do we place Salman Ahmad in this genealogy of these Sufi popular music? I mean, I was just sitting and thinking of names, and, you know, Ustad Pathan Khan, and we already know Abdul Parveen and Nusrat because of their international, you know, acclaim, but Pathan Khan and Muhammad Jumman, Sai Zahoor, Allan Fakir, Alam Lohar, all these people have been doing what Salman claims to have sort of begun in the late 90s, and I'm wondering if this sort of ties in. I mean, I don't have the answer to that, but I'm wondering if it sort of ties into the language politics of Pakistan and how these other people are working with languages like Saraiki and Sindhi and Brahui and Balochi and you know they are being heard all over Pakistan and they're acclaimed masters within nationally, right?
Yeah.
But with Salman, what comes about is this Urdu Punjabi language hegemony, and and also I think tied to that a streamlining of what it means to play popular Sufi music. You know, not just specialized for a special setting like at Shah Latif Bhattai's Masar or something. That's very special poetry and. But generally, on a national level, this is streamlining what Sufi music is supposed to sound like, and all these bands that we've been talking about after that, they're also going on this view that
and they are expressing it in a broader cosmopolitan context, right? By incorporating other traditions. You see, for example, putting in Sufi rock, bringing in Western instrumentations, which makes the way in which they are promoting their message. They are coming from the same roots, but they have re-articulated this tradition within other frameworks, which has then given them access to the global cosmopolitan market. All right? So for example, you take Saint Zahoor, right? He doesn't incorporate any Western music or any Western tradition in his traditional. Right? So you have these very traditional performers, all right? And those traditional performers, they are important within a Pakistani context, but what I'm pointing out with people like Salman is that they're able to take that tradition, reinterpret it within a broader, I would say cosmopolitan, more global context, which has then resulted in them getting this global fame, all right? And he gets this idea about doing this from Nusrat. So you get, Nusrat is really the bridge between this traditional Sufi performer who then starts experimenting, incorporating all this, Western music and so on. And by the way, Nusrat himself was severely criticized by traditional Sufi performers in Pakistan for what he did. So my point here is not to say that this is a better expression of Sufism than the traditional. I am basically interested in the emergence of a new form, Sufi rock. How does this new form emerge? What are its roots? It's not to say that it's better than what the traditional forms are, right? I'm just interested in this, in the implications of this. And the fact that it had broad appeal, not only in Pakistan, but in India and then globally.
Absolutely, and all I was getting at was that while it may appear that it's very inclusivistic and it broadens the horizons of what Sufi music would be like, on another level, it's very restrictive also.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But
But
you have to think about. So my talk was not on Sufi music of Pakistan.
Right.
My talk was the emergence of Sufi rock as a genre. So this is why I took this particular lens. I'm aware that there are other traditions, of course. All right? Yeah. All right.
One more question before we sort of end? Students? No? Imran?
So why not is the question? Yeah, so that's good.
Okay, I guess I can ask. Like, what are the larger political implications for when something is banned in Pakistan but officially even recognized in media in India? Can you comment on that?
Well, this was the time when then, of course, in this times of heightened nationalism, this is where Salman got treated, and the whole group was treated as your traitors to Pakistan, because India recognized you, in the Indian media recognized you. But it shows that because of as political regimes change, you can see in this, as political regimes change, the way they respond to these groups change, and whether so sometimes they'll marginalize them, they'll declare them as traitors. Accusing them almost of treason, and then the regime changes and then say, no, this is really what Pakistan should be. They become representative of the Pakistani of Pakistani identity, a modern Pakistani identity. Okay. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Thank you.